Think of the last data visualization you saw. You probably saw maybe some bars and you noticed that some were tall, some were short. Maybe there were lines and those lines were going up and down and there was too little text to really make sense of anything. Or maybe it was overplotted and there was way too much data to extract anything useful. We've all seen or even made visualizations like this. Visualizations that aren't really going anywhere or don't make sense unless you're already intimately familiar with the underlying data. But how can we take something that's intentionally all-encompassing, something exploratory, and refine it? My name is Cameron Riddell, and that's exactly what we'll discuss today. But first, you have this scenario. You analyze your data, you have your message, but how do we make something that others can easily understand? Well, we often dichotomize our visualizations into two types, exploratory and communicative. And aside from their titles, we need to understand what truly differentiates the two because we'll have some different techniques and different approaches for creating either of these. When it comes to our dichotomized data visualizations, I mentioned there is exploratory and communicative. Our exploratory visualizations are often the ones that we want to automate. There are 1,000,001 different tools that allow you to use a single function, a single method call to very quickly create a visualization based on your data that you can get an eyeball, you get an at-a-glance feeling for, and then from there you decide to pick a specific analysis and take one forking path over another in order to truly refine what's there and understand what's going on with your data. When we have selected our message, when we have selected our analysis, that thing that we want to communicate, we start to transition this all-encompassing exploratory data visualization and refine it into something that supports our message. There are a lot of different tricks to do that, and in order to share those tricks with you, we'll start first by just seeing what data we have here to play with. You can see I have a number of different values for different planets and different planets in different sectors. Here we have a pandas with a multi-index on the columns, and we have our time series as our row index. These values all represent daily temperature readings from the surface of each of these planets. So for example, if we look at a single column, in sector S1, we have 3 planets, Stan, Ivan, and York. And we can see all of their temperature readings in degrees Fahrenheit from here. Now, we have about 5 years worth of data. So this isn't a very small data set. It's not an extremely large data set, but we do have plenty of data to sift through and to make sense of. And now, when we go to visualize these data, of course, we're going to start with something exploratory. We need to figure out a direction that we want to go in. And you'll always need an exploratory data visualization whenever you encounter a new data set. That is still true. Even if you have a priori questions that you want to ask or investigate the data set, you still need to get a feeling for what's there. This will help you understand, were there any errors in the collection of the data? Are there missing data? Were there any mistakes maybe in the entry of the data? Then, once you have performed your exploratory visualization and explored your data, it's time to start answering those questions maybe that you had a priori or investigating observations you made from your exploratory chart. And from here, once you have secured your message or created your analysis, you'll want something to support that, something to back that up. That is where we get into our communicative data visualizations. And the key difference between these two, exploratory is something that you'll do before an analysis. Communicative is something that you do after your analysis. It should be designed to support your analysis. And a great way to understand communicative visualizations is that they should truly stand on their own. They should make an argument and they should back up that argument all on their own. And now we have a number of different tricks that we can start exploring and start applying to our data visualizations to communicate a little bit better. Now, for these data visualization we're about to see, I'll tend to go from something exploratory, something that has a lot of data on it, I'll pick an aspect about that data, and then I'll take that as deep as I can go while highlighting that specific message that I've selected to communicate. And some of the tricks that we have at our disposal are the ability to include relevant or contextual and reference elements. This means that if I want to show data from just a couple of my planets, maybe it would be worthwhile to include the other planets as context. And now you can think, this gets pretty iffy if I have a lot of different features to include, but we have tricks just to accommodate that. Next up, we have our bottom line up front. This is possibly one of the most important aspects of creating a communicative data visualization. This all centers around the fact that your title should be your assertion. The title of a chart, the first thing that anybody looks at, should be your argument or your assertion that you're making about the data, and then you have your viz to back it up. We'll also consider raw versus derived metrics, so just looking at your plotting these raw data values versus deriving some new value, maybe by dividing or by subtracting or comparing one directly to another. You should also consider the channels that we have to communicate with. Using data visualization, we have very, very reliable methodologies or channels when we use the position or the height or the length of a given feature. Worse than that, we can communicate something in color. Oftentimes, I'll double up on using position and color as a redundant signal just to boost that strength a little bit more. And then lastly, our weakest channel, we have angular area. So if you're thinking about using maybe a pie chart, probably not your best bet because you're relying on the interpretation of the angle of a given wedge, or even more realistically, you're probably using the surface area if I'm looking at this to try and figure out which slices of this pie is larger. I would always recommend a bar chart for that because you can use position and length, which are much more robust channels. We can also use things like pre-attentive cues as the intentional use of color or of having a difference in your channels that draws the eye. There are some things that our eyes simply cannot resist and we actually jump immediately to as soon as we notice it in our peripherals. This is the use of pre-attentive cues. This is often used by annotations because the pre-attentive cue will guide your end users or the audience's eye to that location, but it might not have a meaning all on its own, and so we'll add a text annotation, something that describes, okay, my eyes are here, now what am I looking at? Why is this an important place of my visualization? Lastly, in the words of Edward Tufte, we'll explore options that we have for reducing chart junk. This is one of my favorite parts of data visualization, are all those very fine-tuned small tweaks that you can make in Matplotlib because, in my opinion, it is one of the most, if not the most, flexible plotting tool we have out there, at least in the realm of Python. But let's go ahead and dive into our first exploratory data visualization. I'm just going to be using pandas.plot. And so I'll go ahead and read my data in and I'll use the dataframe.plot accessor and we'll see what we end up getting out. From this viz, you can see there's a lot of different features. They overlap slightly. Now, of course, there are going to be too many things to really make sense of. And exploratory data visualizations are often those things that you need to look at for more than just a few seconds. The answers or the interesting aspects won't be there right away, and you do have to look through this thoroughly. But I can tell that I do have a number of features as per my legend, and I can tell that they overlap slightly, but not heavily. In fact, I can actually make out 7 different colors here quite easily, and there's some peaks of red, so maybe the 8th in the background. And so given my legend, I know I have 9 features to look at, but this data visualization is telling me that they don't overlap too heavily. Looking a little bit closer at my legend, I can actually see the blue and the orange and the green all belong to a given sector, since pandas is just plotting these tuples as labels. And I can see that that sector is at the top. And so maybe there might be some stratification. One sector might be hotter than another. And so that could be something that's definitely worth exploring. But let's go ahead and we're going to refine this just a little bit. There is a lot of noise in that exploratory data visualization. Whenever we're working with time series or things that exist on a continuous axis that have a lot of noise in it, it's often useful to take the rolling mean or some rolling or grouped metric so that we can reduce some of that noise, some of the jaggedness of our lines, and look at a much smoother signal. And here you can definitely see there's going to be banding in the sectors. My first sector is up top. My next sector is actually quite tightly clustered in the center. And then my bottom sector, that's S3 of reef, fate, and soul, those are a little bit more spread out. And so that's one observation that I could take and I could run with that. I could see, okay, which sector has the widest range in daily observations of temperatures? But I think there's something else going on here, something else that's very interesting to look at. And if you look very closely, you can see that there is a slight trajectory of each of these lines. And this trajectory is telling me that across the years, there's an overall increase in the average temperature. So maybe these planets are continuously warming at a slow rate. And so that could be another message that I could take, I could run with, and I could refine and create a visualization that really highlights that. Additionally, you'll notice there's seasonality or periodicity in this signal as well. You can see at the beginning and the end of each year, we have low average temperatures, and during the peaks, which would be the summers, right, we have high average temperatures as well. And so there is some seasonality. All of these planets are on the same annual schedule, so we won't just be examining the relative years, but the overall date times of each of these. Now, if I wanted to really dive into that observation where year over year we saw an increase in temperature, I could do something with just like take the rolling mean of my entire year, so 365 days at a time, and what this will be doing is effectively create a window 1 year in width, and I'll be taking the average temperature and then I'll be plotting each of those averages. Now what this does is this removes that seasonality from the signal. What we saw where the early months or in the later months were colder than the mid months, and this lets me really start to dial in on all of these lines have a very slight slope to them. And so let's see what we can do with that by communicating what is the average increase in annual temperature. And so the very first thing that I would recommend doing is we'll tweak our figure just a little bit. I didn't like the legend that was overlapping onto our figure, and so I'll just bump that out to the side for now. Now the next thing that I might consider doing here is it's very hard. You have to squint very hard to see or to notice that there is a slight increase in these slopes. And so I really am going to need to highlight this message and highlight it well. The first thing that I want to do, bottom line up front, set a title, make it nice and large, and have that title stand for what is it that I'm supposed to be looking at here. And so I could set a title as simple as temperature increases across all sectors, and I could even say all stars in all sectors. We're seeing a galaxy-wide temperature increase here across the 9 planets that I'm seeing. After we set our bottom line up front, which is the most informative, the best thing you could do, and what I'll share with you what I often see. Instead of putting the bottom line up front, where I say assert that temperature increases across all stars, I'll often see something like this. Temperatures of different planets. This is a very descriptive title, but it is not pointing to me what I'm supposed to be gaining from here. And now if this was an exploratory data visualization, sure, that's going to be just fine. But when you want to create something that's communicative, when you want to convey a point, you should put that point right at the top. This is in the exact same lines. I enjoy cooking in my free time, but I'm not like a creative cook. I don't come up with something from scratch. Instead, what I do is I Google recipes. And if you've ever read a recipe online that's attached to somebody's blog post, you know that you need to read through the first 5 paragraphs of their life history, how it was their great-grandmother's recipe, and then finally, all the way at the bottom, they get into what the actual recipe is. We want to avoid all of that nonsense because we want to convey a clear message. And we do that by putting the bottom line up front or by asserting our title as the first thing that somebody looks at and what they should take away. Then we have our data to back up our title. Now, given this visualization, I'm not super convinced just yet. I can see there's a slight slope in each of these lines, but it's really not hitting me. The slope looks very small, and so I might just say, well, it might be increasing, but it's just ever so slight, and I can't really see the extreme that it's going to. And so something that we might want to do is we might want to consider our channels, the metrics that we're reporting on here. And so I could, instead of using a line chart with a bunch of lines that slowly increase, I could resample. I could take all of my data, aggregate it down to a single number per year, and I'm going to aggregate across all of my planets here, and I can create a bar chart, let's say. And now, of course, we could clean up the x-axis here, and we'll need to turn our legend off, just like that. But you can start to see, okay, if my left-hand bar is the earliest year and the right-hand bar is the latest year, I can see these bars are slightly increasing, but there's still so much visual space being used to represent the height of each of these bars that the message is being lost, because the really interesting point is just seeing the change in the height of these bars. And so I wouldn't say that resampling down to a bar is going to be our best bet. Instead of that derived metric, right, of the mean change in temperature from each planet, what if we did this? What if we took our original data, the original chart that we saw, and I subtracted the very first observation? I'll quickly rewind this so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. What if I took the very first observation from each planet and subtracted it from the rest of the data? This is going to normalize my data so that they all start at 0, and they end at whatever delta from they started. And so, if I do just that, I'm going to derive a new metric here. I'm going to plot this. And we can actually start to see, okay, in 2001, January, we have our 0th data point. This is when I first started recording temperatures of planets. Then, 5 years later, I have all of my data, and I'm seeing how far away from that very first date we have come. I'm using much more of my visual space. I'm using the slope of these lines to more reliably relay information about the change in temperature, which is what my message is all about. So let's grab our bottom line up front, that temperature increases across all sectors. Now, of course, this isn't the raw data. This is a derived metric. I've done subtraction. I've actually changed the data that I'm representing. And so, of course, I would need to accurately represent that with my Y label. And so I might do something, right, like have my Y label be the yearly average change in temperature since 2001. That Y label is a little lengthy, but since we are using a derived metric, we often do need a lengthier Y label. And so you need to consider, when using a derived metric or when reporting with a derived metric, make sure it's something that's understandable, especially for your audience, because when we're communicating a message, we always need to consider our audience. Now, we can add another layer. We can use some pre-attentive cues here. And so let's go ahead and do just that. I'll keep my derived data here, and I'm going to grab a new axis. And so I want to share with you, instead of having all of the legends or all of the labels for each of these lines, I'm just going to say, I don't care about the individual planets here. I want to show just all of the planets. And my pre-attentive cue here is that by dropping the color channel out of color coding each individual planet, I can use that color channel for something else. Specifically, I'm going to use the color red here to plot the mean change in temperature from each planet at all of my data points. And now what I'm using here is I'm using this red line to highlight what's the overall trend that we're seeing. And now my end user, my audience, instead of having to look at and kind of eyeball 8 different planets, they can look at a single trend line and understand that there are other trends that are backing this up. And so I've really filtered down the full amount of data that I'm using here, and I'm using color to draw your eyes to a single location. Now, we might also want to draw a little bit more attention to this colored line, and so I might plot something like the 25th and 75th percentile of these data around this line, and so you can really see, okay, given my average change in temperature, what is the quantiles around that? And this really focuses your eye just on this trend that's clearly going upwards from left to right. Now, the last thing that I would typically do for any communicative data visualization, reduce the chart junk. And oftentimes, I'll share this X label with you. Oftentimes, I see date or time on your x-axis, especially if it's time series data. What I'm going to say to you is this. Do not put a label if your x-axis is a date time. If I see 2001-01, if I see the letters Jan 1st, 2001, I already know your x-axis is dates. We don't need this label. It is redundant. It's a little silly, and so I would definitely leave it off. The next thing I'll do, I'm going to tighten up the margins. There was a lot of white space on either side of this chart, and so what I want to do is I'm going to stretch it out just a little bit more to really have your eyes, the only thing that you can focus on is going to be that line increasing. Now there's a couple of other tricks here that I'll use. Instead of having years and months, I'm just going to highlight the start of each year. I'm just going to tick the start of each year, and I'll rotate my labels so that they're flat and that this chart is very easily readable. And now from this, we went from the raw data, which had a very small increase, and we zoomed in on that. We used a derived metric to zoom in on that. We added our nicely argumentative title, and we're letting the data corroborate itself. This is the mark of a communicative data visualization. But let's move on. Let's do another exploratory data visualization, and let's really analyze what's going on in each sector. Now, to juxtapose this against our original data visualization where we had a lot of lines all in a single chart and we could see a very similar pattern across each of them, sometimes it's nice or convenient to facet our data here. And by faceting, right, I'm just going to be splitting this chart up into multiple charts, and I'm going to break out each sector so that they're independent from one another. From here, I might start to really hone in on that pattern where, oh, Sector 1 is hotter than Sector 2, which is hotter than Sector 3. And I'm able to make this observation because I'm sharing my y-axis, which is a very powerful technique. Whenever you are using facets, you should always try and share one of the axes, and that that helps you perform across-axis comparisons, or across-group, in this case, comparisons. Now, if I want to zoom in a little bit on that Sector 1, well, maybe I would just sub-select a couple of planets. So here we have our original data visualization, and what if I just want to focus in on the two hottest planets here from Sector 1? I want to focus on, and looking at my legend here, Ivan and York. And what I'll do is I can start filtering my data. Oftentimes, we have too much data that we're trying to show at once, especially for something that's communicative. And so it's in our best interest to really just filter that down. And so I'll go ahead and I'm going to get rid of the other lines here, and we'll just plot our hottest planets. What's really interesting here is that if you're familiar with the data like myself, your eyes will immediately jump to the start of 2003 when Ivan, the blue line, became hotter than York. And now you might be thinking, Cameron, you already knew that was there. How am I supposed to know that's there? That's exactly what I'm going to show you, because I don't think this chart right now does a good job of putting that message right in front of you. And so let's see what else we can do. Well, we could include context, which we did before. I don't think this will make that specific message any more in your face, so to speak, or obvious, but this does let us know where the other planets are at in terms of temperature without overwhelming us with what planet's where and what sector does it belong to. But let's just focus on those hottest planets. How else might we plot that data? Well, we could go back and revisit our raw versus derived. I might do something like subtract the temperatures of Ivan from York, and then now if you are positive, you are, and I have to look back at my calculation here, if you're in the positives, that means Ivan was hotter, and if you're in the negatives, that means York was hotter. Well, since I can't remember that without looking at my code, I will probably need to annotate that, and I'll do that just by adding a horizontal line at 0, representing that there's no difference, and then I'll add some annotations here saying that Ivan is higher or York is higher, depending on which side of this axis you're sitting on. And I think this is another one of those occasions where using the derived metric introduces just a little bit more confusion than it's worth. And so we might want to think, is there some way better that we can communicate this information? Well, I think it is very effective. It does really get you to focus on who's hotter, York or Ivan. What we've lost here, what we've lost from this chart is the context, right? I can tell that Ivan is hotter than York, and I can tell something very significant happened at 2003. That much is very obvious. But how hot was Ivan? How hot was York? Is this the difference between 30 degrees and 40 degrees, or is this the difference between 70 degrees and 80 degrees? I've lost out on that context. And so we actually have a slight trade-off to make here. Do we want to include the context, or do we want to really put a message in front of someone? And there is a slight happy medium that we can take here. If I just plot the original data from my 2 hottest planets, I can start to fill the area between, because that's what I want to communicate. I want to draw people's eyes to the difference between each of these planets. And how I can do that is by filling in between each of these planets. And there's one more trick that I can use. I'm going to color code whether or not York is on top. And so what you're going to see here is by filling between these lines, if you see an orange line filled between, or an orange patch filled between, well, that means York was hotter. The orange line is on top. But if you see a blue filled between, then you can very clearly see that Ivan's on top. Ivan was hotter. And you get this very nice transition. If you examine the full chart, you actually can see when orange switches into blue. And this is trying to get my message across that, hey, at this point in time, Ivan became hotter than York. And so maybe there's something worth investigating there, right? So in order to highlight that message even further, I'm going to use another annotation. I'm going to use a vertical line, and I'm going to use another text-based annotation. And I'm going to say that at this point in time, Ivan overtook York. By using a strong vertical line like this, I'm really drawing your eyes to this specific point, and you can really see blue is on the right, orange is on the left. Ivan is clearly hotter than York. Now, I would of course need to put my bottom line up front, set a nice title for this, set my Y labels, set my X labels. I do want to spare you from a little bit of those mechanics since we've already seen them, and I want you to take home this. The transition from orange to blue, that's not something that's going to draw the eyes. The inclusion of a vertical line, that's going to draw the eyes, especially having a label near the top, because we typically scan any data visualization or really any picture in an F format. And now what the F format is, I tend to look at the top left. This is why the title is so important. And then you scan to the right. You go back to the top left. You make your way down to the mid of the chart. And then you go mostly to the right. And then you scan all the way bottom. And it kind of ends up, the search path ends up looking a little bit like the capital letter F. And by including a label near the top center of our chart, we're really forcing the attention to this point in time, saying this is important. And then we're supplementing that with the color transition from a categorical orange to a categorical blue to reiterate that something has changed here. What we are missing out on, though, is the degree of the difference. This is what that derived metric did much better, in my opinion. I could actually calculate or quantitatively report how much hotter was York than Ivan at any given point in time. From here, you kind of have to guess. But I think this chart does a much better job of conveying the message that at 2003, the beginning of 2003, Ivan became hotter than York. I don't necessarily need to report how much hotter, but I do have a visual guidance or a visual hint for how much hotter. Now, the last thing that we'll want to do, we'll want to clean up some of that chart junk. And so we'll get rid of the legend. We're going to use one of my favorite tricks of inlining a legend. And oftentimes when we have a legend here in the top left, I need to make a lot of visual jumps. The blue line's Ivan. I jump down. I see the blue line. Okay, that makes sense. The orange line is York. I need to jump down and see that the orange line is York. Inlining a legend is the removal of the legend itself in favor for text-based annotations that are inside of your chart and actually label the chart for you. And so instead of the legend there, I'm going to inline my legend here, and you can see that I have labeled Ivan and York on the right-hand side of my chart. I might actually make these a little bit larger as well, and then space them a little bit out further to the right, but I think you get the idea that my eyes no longer need to jump from blue to blue or orange to orange because I've put them right next to each other. And so there's a great technique for removing chart junk, because when communicating a message, you want it to be as simple as it can be while also communicating something very original or effective. And so keep it as simple as it can be. And so in summary, we have all of our different tricks. You want to consider your audience first. Who am I speaking to? Will they understand the derived metrics that I'm using? Or should I really iterate this message in its raw form? Include relevant contextual and reference elements, right? Make sure you don't lose too much of the data, but at the same time, to simplify your message, don't be afraid to filter your data. So you have to find that happy medium that exists between using too little context and using too much context. Bottom line up front, set your title. It should be your argument, not just an observation of Y versus X. That's the worst title you can use of temperature over time. Nobody wants to see that. I can look at the Y and X axis and conclude that from 2 seconds on my own. Tell me what I should be looking for. Consider those raw versus derived metrics. This also falls in line with considering your audience. The derived metrics are great for reporting very specific things, but if it causes you to lose out on some of that context, well, maybe it's not the route that you want to go. Think about the channels that you can communicate. We saw a lot of line charts today, and we were using the filled area. But you also have things like bar charts. We saw great use of colors today, and we didn't see too much use of the angular area because I don't think they're great communication mechanisms. But we did see a little bit of the area when it came to that time for the fill between. Embed your pre-attentive cues and then annotate them. These things will have your audience's eyes jump straight to a specific point, and then you can tell them what they're supposed to be looking at. Why is this section of my chart so important? And finally, Edward Tufte, reduce chart junk. Whew, that takes us to the end of our session today. I wanted to thank each and every one of you for coming out, and I also wanted to let you all know that I'm more than happy to share this code and notes with you today on Discord. All you need to do is ask in our Discord channel, say, hey Cameron, can I have the code and notes for today? I'm more than happy to share that with you. I also wanted to share that you should keep an eye out on our newsletter, on our LinkedIn, and on our Twitter, because we'll have some more upcoming sessions announced for you to sign up for, and I'm looking very much forward to those sessions. Thank you all again for coming, and I hope to see you again real soon.